Astrology soulmates. I think that's what Stormie says. I'm really excited to be with the Stormie Grace YouTube Academy as a guest lecturer. My name is Rebecca Farrar, and I'm an archetypal astrologer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this topic is something that is so near and dear to my heart because it's something I talk about with my clients every day. It's obviously very vast, and I by no means claim to have the perfect answers or the perfect formula or know everything about this topic. But it's something I spend a lot of time with in my own process of figuring out why I'm here and also with other people. It's really fun to kind of meet a soul and be able to kind of mirror back what seems obvious maybe to us and not to ourselves. But I think I've bitten off a bit more than I can chew on this topic, and I realize that. So whatever resonates, great. Whatever doesn't resonate, leave. I'm just putting out a few of kind of my own way that I've oriented to this kind of formula. And an aspect of this too is living into the mystery of it, right? Life purpose and meaning. When I think anytime we kind of claim to know what it is or the exact answers, we're kind of missing the point. So I want to hold this really lightly, like I do in all my sessions, with there's a mystery of the soul that I will never claim to be an expert on. And I'm excited to share maybe how I've tried to tease out some of that mystery for myself. And I think with that, I'll just dive into the presentation. And we will begin from there. Okay. Oops. All right. So again, my name is Rebecca Farrar. I add the MA. I don't want to be snobby. It's also just, I worked really hard and paid a lot of money for it. And I feel like I should try to own that education really impacted me in a big way, especially around the topic we're going to talk about in a moment. And I'll say why. So life purpose and legacy in the natal chart. There's my business, Wild Witch of the West. And at the end, I'll have places where you can find me, but I am on Instagram, Wild Witch of the West. And you can also Google that and find me online as well. So I want to speak just briefly a little bit about like why me, like why am I sharing about this topic, and also not really what makes me qualified, because that feels a little strange, but I'm an archetypal astrologer and writer. My master's degree is in philosophy. And the reason why this feels important to me is, the first philosophers in the Greek era were also the first astrologers and astronomers in kind of the Western psyche. So I don't want to, I would never, ever assume, obviously astrology was in Babylonia and there were all these other places, but there's something about the shift in human consciousness for me that really happened around that Greek and Roman transition, where thought and these bigger questions around meaning started to kind of make its way into the human psyche in a new way. As those philosophers became, through the centuries, I would say that's certainly where more of the white supremacy and capitalist thought and patriarchal thought happened. But these early Greek philosophers were extremely enchanted with the cosmos. They were extremely enchanted with what they saw in the sky. They were naming planet as a wandering star. So there's a lot of kind of homage I want to pay to the part of us in our brain when we can orient to their thinking. And that is what I loved about getting a master's degree in this topic. And my graduate school research was in the human connection to the stars and language, and how the words we speak are actually incredibly connected to the stars and incredibly connected to the cosmos. And we often don't even notice that. But that's a whole other story. On my website, there's also a link to read my thesis. I think probably only 3 people in the entire world have ever read it, but that's what happens with research. Another important distinction is that being an archetypal astrologer, I'm in the lineage of Richard Tarnas, and I studied with him during my master's degree. I didn't know anything about it. I used to think astrology was so dumb before I started that program. And what I started to really understand was that the way I was orienting to astrology was this very oversimplified way where it was just the zodiac. And with archetypal astrology, the whole point is to really tease out the complexity. And that's the archetypes, right? It's the part of us where instead of just being a Taurus, I would describe myself as, okay, I've got a Taurus sun, conjunct Chiron, opposite Uranus, trine Mars. It gives us more of that sort of, how do we see the bigger picture? And that was what made me kind of start to really appreciate astrology, is when I could track and see those personality traits in me that I didn't identify as a Taurus. I thought they were kind of heavy and stubborn and materialistic. And yes, there's a part of me that's really grounded and materialistic, but the Uranian part of me is very ungrounded and kind of neurotic. And and all these different aspects that happen with my moon and how I process my emotions. And so for me, archetypal astrology is an important distinction, because I realize that my lens is not maybe as traditional. And so if your background is in that, I think it's amazing. And I just want to name that mine is different. And so parts of it may not feel as good to you. I don't know. But archetypal astrology has been for me what had me start to come closer to astrology. It's really connected to the archetypes of Jung and depth psychology, and kind of how the soul moves, with this early thought kind of as the background. So that's a little bit of background. That is not my current apartment. I miss that apartment. But yeah, I thought it'd be nice to have a photo of me when I maybe was a little bit more imposed than Zoom. Okay, the Aries moon part of me just loves quotes and inspirational quotes. So I wanted to share two of my favorites. Move this up a little bit, because this is where we're starting to get into this consciousness of the soul. We're starting to really orient to what makes us come alive, what animates this reason for being here. And the early philosophers were asking these questions, right? Like, what is this human connection to the stars? Why do I exist? What's the point of all of this, right? And so we can go one direction, which becomes more kind of nihilistic and existential, which is like, it's all meaningless, there's nothing interesting. I prefer the philosophies where we go more towards that enchantment, more towards the soul, more towards a telos, a reason for being here, that there is an evolution that is both us and the collective that we're a part of. To me, this is where astrology really meets, is when we get to see this place where the cosmos and the individual co-create. And so these quotes, Daniel Rudyard and Thomas More, one of my favorite philosophers, very Jungian based, soul centric. When you don't follow your nature, there's a hole in the universe where you were meant to be. So again, this meeting point between the individual and the collective. And then Thomas More, only when you are fully engaged can you see the activity that will make your life feel worth living. And these are both, for me, pointing to life purpose, soul purpose, and also this uncovering process, which is the whole point. I don't believe that life purpose is suddenly figured out and then that's it. It's like the chart. There's an entire, we can spend our whole lives paying attention to the chart and watching it evolve and watching different parts of us come alive. And so our life purpose may have several different pieces that maybe coalesce at different moments. And I love that both of these are really speaking to kind of that unfolding as well. There's a few distinctions. The philosophy brain in me, it's so important when we're going to ask the questions, is also, what is this shared agreement about what we're speaking to? So life purpose versus legacy. For me, another distinction is like the soul versus life purpose, a job versus a calling, and then the big question of individuation. So I want to just go through these a little bit briefly. Legacy versus life purpose, I would describe, and the lens that I'm using to describe this doesn't mean that it's true. The legacy piece would be, what do I want to be remembered for, versus a life purpose of, why am I here? So an example for myself would be, I feel strongly my life purpose is about enchantment and creating more beauty. But my legacy is probably more tied to my business, where it's about wanting people to feel seen or nurturing different parts of them. They're there, but it's not this direct correlation. And then soul versus life purpose, I would put those in the same. For me, the soul is what animates our life. And so the life purpose is animated through the lens of the soul. And a job versus a calling. Again, I would say a calling is a life purpose. I don't necessarily think that our jobs and the work we do or the things we do to make money have to be with our life purpose. When I was getting my master's degree and I was inspired by my research, that wasn't what I was doing for work. I was still kind of working and wherever. So my job, I just needed to make money. And so the calling and my job at that point were very separate. I don't always think they have to intersect. And then the big question, which is individuation. And so I tend to think of individuation as kind of the reason for being. It's to follow the soul. It's to watch the soul unfold. But individuation at its core is about seeking wholeness. And this is a very, it's created by Jung. I'd say his wife, Emma Jung, also has a big influence around that there's this wholeness that is pulling us forward in our lives. And for me, the wholeness is the whole chart. And the chart gives us clues to that wholeness. But the becoming ourselves is kind of the whole point. And so, how do we become ourselves? And that for me has these tools and these practices that we can use to do that. All right. So now I want to shift gears a little bit back to Plato and pay homage to this consciousness where there were these humans, of course, mostly white men, watching the sky and noticing changes in the sky and trying to understand, where did the soul come from? How did I land on this planet? And, this quote, the soul came to being at the same time as the sky. There's two big influences Plato had on, for me, my astrological understanding. So one comes from the text called the Timaeus, which is like the creation cosmic story. And in this, he describes the idea that every human has a companion star, and that this companion star whispers to us our path. Okay, that may be more of my added narrative, but that there's this companion star that is created and that will return to the star upon our death. This just fills me with so much kind of like this romantic ideal that the telos, the way I'm going, the point is returning to that star. But how do I do that? Through living my life and listening to where I'm going from that star. So I love that concept. It actually inspired my research in my graduate school program. And the word desire comes from await what the stars bring. And to me, that word is kind of what Plato is evoking, as we're listening to our desire through this star. The other text that I find really useful in this context is the myth of air. And Plato wrote this as a conversation around how souls came to earth and how they started life. And so this image that I'm using is from that myth. And in this story, it is Plato discussing, okay, so there's these souls, they have, I think you just have like a lottery or a token that we receive. And once our token time has arrived, in this realm of souls, we go to, and then we get to look out at these potential life paths and we get to decide which one we want. And then we choose, and then the fates, it's called the spindle of necessity, and that's how the planets orbit. And then you're kind of like dropped into Earth. My vision is that the natal chart is a big part of this kind of spindle, this orbiting. It's like the fates are weaving the chart as they're after we choose. I prefer to think about it in that way. That feels really beautiful. So we can see the web of wholeness that is the birth chart. So that's kind of the imaginal realm and this lens of, if we're uncovering the life purpose, we're uncovering the soul purpose, we really have to get to what's in our story, what's in this soul story that we're creating here on earth. And so we've arrived, according to Plato, we're in the soul. And then the next piece for me for understanding life purpose has to do with called involution. And involution comes from integral philosophy, but it's this idea that everything that exists first came from source, involved. Was the opposite of evolve. We're talking about going down rather than up. And that's for me the notion of the soul and life purpose, is it's more of a going in and a simultaneously going up, and that soul is sitting between. It's this meeting point between earth and ether, between the material world and the source. And so this first, what happens is we evolve into the material world, and then we kind of do this dance where we're like trying to evolve back up. And that's what happens over time. And so the image on the left is one that I've created just for me visually to understand this relationship. And then the other one is from integral philosophy around this initial involution. So again, this is more of a philosophical, if this isn't interesting, I think I'm just trying to make sure that my lens is I know that this is my lens and it may not resonate. And I think it's kind of fun to think about these ideas of how these early minds and other philosophers have thought that this process was. All right, so here's where we really get to the juice. So this is kind of my formula for the aspects of soul purpose, the aspects of life purpose. And I've described them in kind of these 5 ways, going back to this companion star of, what are these pieces In my description, I was using 8, and I wanted to just kind of trim it down a little bit to get a little bit more basic. I have these other ideas that it just felt overly complicated to add for the presentation. So I'm just going to go with 5 for this purpose. I like to start at the bottom of the star and start first with soul safety. So I think about soul safety, for me, this is the moon, and we'll talk about that. But it's like, what does the soul need in order to stay grounded, involved on earth, and stable? Because we can't, it's like we have to have the roots before we can really reach up. And so the soul safety is, what do we need in order to go up? The other aspect would be soul school. Like, what did we actually really come here to learn? And so how do we move forward when we pay attention to what we came here to learn rather than what we already know? This is more of the north and south node. Look at the life legacy as, how we're going to be remembered, and like combination of like the midheaven and a few other pieces. The life lessons as more related to Chiron and kind of the places we came here to heal. So it may be related to Chiron. Sometimes it can be these other pieces that feel ouchy, but the life lessons are like, where is this meeting point again between my soul and the collective? And how do I move those forward together so that I am making an impact in my life, has meaning because of these things? And then the soul spark, which is for me, like what lights us up, what ignites us, what makes us feel good. So these can be related to our strengths that we get to utilize in the world. Or it can be this thing of like, what are we passionate about? What gets us excited? What? And I relate this often to the sun. Like, what is this spark where we're like, oh, wow, yeah, that feels really good. So ideally, we're kind of putting together a puzzle based on these pieces of the star. And again, I'm using life and soul purpose kind of interchangeably. So that's a bit of an intro. So let's dive in with the soul spark. And so the way I would do this is, I'm not going to pause between kind of each slide, but this is recorded, so you can pause at any moment and take your time. When I'm writing out stuff about the chart, I like to use columns. And a big piece of archetypal astrology is that I'm asking these questions of, what do you shine? What lights you up? Your sense of self, your strengths. I'm putting these in kind of columns as a way so that I can kind of mix and match, right? So maybe all the keywords of my soul spark and the sun, all the keywords of my moon, the keywords of Chiron. And then I'm kind of just like looking where there's some lines, looking at how I can weave this web. You could put them into those 5 places and do it that way. I tend to like kind of the columns where I can see all the words really easily. And so when I'm mixing parts of my chart, I'll write down, okay, the sun in Taurus, here are my pieces. I'll write down aspects of Mars, those pieces. I'll write down aspects of Chiron, and then I'll just kind of draw lines and explore. So that's what I would encourage you to do is, we're paying homage to Plato. We're reweaving perhaps what these fates were using when we were born, what was being woven. And so we're kind of trying to recreate that tapestry in some way with this practice. So you can kind of write these down however feels best to you. I like the columns. Some people like to just write random places and then draw lines. I have no clear direction on that at the moment. All right, so if we think about the soul spark, what animates us, of course, this for me is so much of the sun. And it's important here to also really look at the aspects to the sun, because that gives us clues that we may not see otherwise, right? So if we've got our sun, trine Neptune, this intuitive part of us needs to get met somehow too. We can't ignore, we've got a sun in Capricorn. We can't ignore that Neptune, because that's a whole part of us that lights up and has this skill set. And if we don't pay attention to it, we may miss a big aspect of kind of why we're here and what gets us excited. And what are we shining out, right? Like what is this unique constellation and star that is us? And so the aspects to me play a really important role for that as well. Okay, so then I want to move to the moon. I probably made more sense to start with the soul safety, but if we think about the moon in the charts, it's obviously how we process emotions, our home life, what makes us feel balanced. So it's again this idea of how do we reach down before we can reach up. And the sun and the moon also constellate something really important around the idea of individuation, because the moon is kind of our unprocessed, unconscious, often needs that are met and unmet, versus the sun, which is how we want to be seen. And so much of the individuation process is how do we bring those two together? So for me, the soul spark and the soul safety really have to find a meeting point. We can't just stay focused on our sun, because then what we're expressing into the world doesn't have the roots and this internal world. And if we just really over identify with the moon, then the internal world we can't be out in the world seeing what we need to see. So this balancing of the inner and the outer is really where we can see the wholeness start to be created. And so those are also why I'm starting with these two as well. The idea of individuation and these other pieces feel really important to this. And it also feels like if that's something you want to explore more, there's other ways to do that. But I wanted to just this soul safety, right? Like we can't reach upward. We can't move towards this star, this guiding light, unless we really make sure that our roots are stable. And during a time such as COVID, where there's so much kind of collective shift as well, taking care of the moon and knowing those patterns of the moon are what make it possible for us to kind of come back out of the cocoon in a really healthy way. All right, so this is the soul safety piece. So now the soul school, and I describe these as the lunar nodes. And so it's what I like to describe it as, if Earth is a college, what did you come here to major in? What did you come here to study? So some traditions, there's a little bit more of a sense of avoiding the South Node or focusing on the North Node. My idea tends to be more that we go back and forth, but the things don't really move forward until we focus on the North Node, because it's what we know. It's that comfort zone we're trying to kind of move out of. So when people get stuck, especially when I talk to clients, I often find the stuckness has to do with that we're not following our soul school. We're not studying what we came here to study. And once we lean into that, something can kind of break open. So yeah, I find the lunar nodes to be such an important piece of this, also because there are other people in our soul school, right? The lunar nodes don't, they change signs for a year and a half, 2 years. And so we are in this process where we're moving through the same soul school with the same people sometimes. And I love that too, that we can learn and have similar soul experiences. I would call them probably companion souls from that lunar node space. So this can't be the whole life purpose, because that would mean that almost everyone born around the same time as you would have that same purpose. And so the complexity for the purpose for me has to come from all these different places to really make it unique. This seemed intense, but it's like unique. You. All right, so then the life lessons piece. And so Chiron is, my son is next to Chiron. So Chiron for me always feels like so much more of a big deal than maybe it does to other people. But I describe this as the life lesson. So this is the place where we're going to bump against something. It's the place where we feel like there's something wrong with us, the place where something feels off that needs fixing, the part of us that wants to maybe save people or be saved. What do we call the Chiron complex? In psychological terms, it would be like a pattern or a way of being. I find Chiron to be the most complicated thing to kind of sort through in our life purpose, because we have our Chiron return at 50, we have this, Uranus opposition at 40. It's like we're trying to spark and bring awareness. And Chiron is often where that kind of integration around like, oh, right, this is what I came here to heal. And before that point, it may be that we're really struggling with what our life lessons are. And it takes us a while to find them. So there's so much more I could say about Chiron in terms of the complex and the insecurity that it often brings, just speaking from personal experience, kind of this shadow side of kind of like really not wanting to be seen often, at the same time, like wanting to share. Chiron wants to share wisdom. It wants to offer support. It can also be the part that works really hard to be liked and loved, because it's like the sense of self can feel more fragile when it comes to Chiron. So the life lessons for me are a big place there. And I also associate this with the idea of the golden shadow, where it's the piece of how are we looking at the parts that are insecure, where we may have a tendency to pedestalize other people who have the qualities that we have, but we think we don't have. Again, that's another integration point for the Chiron return. It's the tender part. It's the insecure part. It's also the place where the meeting, again, between the external, the collective, and the personal occur. It's this magical place with Chiron. And then I also see Chiron as related to our individuation. It's wholeness. The Chiron senses that there's something wrong. I'm not whole. I'm not together. So Chiron in healing and in individuation is that reminder that we are whole. even if we're not seeing it, or even if it's hard to notice. This kind of a constant needing to remember that sense that doesn't feel right is actually right, sort of thing. Okay, so that it also rules the hands. And so this motion of healing ourselves, putting energy towards ourselves is another aspect of Chiron. Okay, so I added these kind of other pieces of the nadir and the midheaven, not because I think of them as a part of that 5-pointed star, but just as aspects kind of on our journey. So I think of the nadir, the lowest point of the chart. You know, the Greeks called it the swampland of the soul. That sounds very dramatic. I kind of like it. It's also like the elements of home that would be shadowy, more inherited parts. Obviously, the moon and the sun have lineage pieces in there, but that fourth house can really give us a clue of like, where am I getting stuck because it's from my family versus me? What am I just inheriting? What are my ancestors? How do they move through me? And the individuation process being, how do I break free from those pieces and go towards my own path to wholeness rather than what I thought maybe was that? Okay. And then lastly, with the midheaven, this is where I would identify more of the legacy. So it's the individuated path. It's the path of, if I am whole, complete, and perfect, what am I moving towards that is unique, that is mine to share with the world, separate from where I've been and my family, and also these kind of maybe more unconscious patternings? That would be the midheaven. Of course, looking at the planets and the aspects in that placement being a big part of it. So these are all things you can just kind of write out on columns or write in different places on a paper and kind of find the web, create the map. And then beyond astrology and kind of life purpose, here are some other tools. I would describe some of them as like more soul care work. How do we, again, if we're looking at the soul, we need to involve first. It's important for us to go in. That's why when I'm trying to find purpose, I don't necessarily reach for something upward. I don't know that I'm like prayer or meditation. I tend to be more into the downward motion when it comes to the soul, because that's how the soul came into the material world. So creativity and art, practices of enchantment, right? Like looking at something and really finding what makes it beautiful and kind of practicing being in awe of it. Dream work, you know, recording your dreams, sometimes interpreting it, other times just like letting it exist. Sometimes I do rituals. Jung was really big on rituals around it. Nature time and intentional solitude are the same for me. I have a daily walk I do by myself. It's also a part of, I think, Julia Cameron's new book on the artist's way, where you also need time alone in nature. Mythology. This is a huge one for archetypal astrology because it's where we see the myths of those archetypes play out in our daily lives. And sometimes there are reasons we're pulled to certain mythologies, and those are giving us a slice of like maybe what is tied to our life purpose that we couldn't see just in the chart, but there's a character who is showing us our path that is similar. Morning pages, also Julia Cameron, and golden shadow work. You know, I love to sometimes write down the people that I admire, the qualities that I like in them, the people I tend to want to lift up and pedestalize, paying attention to why I'm doing that, because there probably is something in them that I am not owning for myself. So instead of the dark shadow or shadow projections that are negative, this is the shadow projection that's actually positive. Of course, human design, Enneagram, Tarot, Gene Keys, all these other tools where, you know, they offer us pieces. Again, I don't think that any one system can really hold the complexity of the soul. And I think there's so many things to be received from all of them. Okay, and then finally, just to kind of, that was a whirlwind. There was a lot in there. I think this practice of just like mapping and being the curiosity for me is the best way to do it. I am, however, creating a membership that has more of like a very specific kind of formula that like unfolds over time over the course of about a year. And I'll be launching that in early 2022. So I have a sign up sheet on my Instagram, Wild Witch of the West, or on my website, the Life Purpose Membership. So if you are curious in kind of other tools or other ways I'm moving this forward and wanting to help people kind of find their own, that would be the way to do it. I also offer one-on-one readings, including astro mapping, because place, of course, also has a big piece around how this soul and life purpose can unfold. But yeah, I also just invite you to reach out. I'm curious what felt great to you, maybe what didn't resonate so much. This is an unfolding process for all of us. to watch the soul come to be, to watch our wholeness, to watch our purpose become. It's such a magical gift to get to kind of live into that. So I hope you have such an amazing day. Thank you again to Stormie Grace YouTube Academy for having me. And these are the ways you can find me if and when it feels right. All right. Thank you so much.